Tamara Lanier is not only an amazing freedman, she's the descendant of Renty, and we're trying to free Renty. Renty had his pictures taken by uh,
Oh,
the Harvard and stolen and profited upon by their museums at Harvard. And
yeah.
what we're trying to do today is not only talk about Tamara Lanier, celebrate her on Juneteenth, this special day, and talk about freeing Renty, but let her share her story about her discovery about how she connected with her ancestor.
Mhm.
That is so special. And then not only how she connected with her ancestor, but how she went from there to then fighting Harvard, right? And the battle is still going, but God willing, she's going to win, and I believe it because she has right on her side, right? And that is the thing that will help win. And I just want her to be able to just speak as long as she wants to
Wow.
about her amazing story. We had her in the spaces in March. Oh my God, she stole everybody's heart.
Yeah.
People was telling me, download the space. Where is this space? They were asking me for it. So you did it. So we're gonna do it here again today, but even better. And I just really am glad that you're here and wish you the best again on this Juneteenth. So, shout out to your ancestors. Happy Father's Day to Renty,
Yes.
right? As a fathers to you,
Mm-hmm.
and to any of your ancestors that you want to wish that to. So,
Great.
go for it. Take it away.
Okay. Good afternoon. Can you hear me? I'm assuming everyone can hear me, correct? Okay, my mic is on, so I'm assuming everyone can hear me. Good afternoon. My name is Tamara Lanier, and I am the plaintiff in the Lanier v. Harvard reparations lawsuit. And I bring you greetings from a small coastal community in southeastern Connecticut. I live in Norwich. But I want to say to the members of the Freedoms Party family, thank you for this opportunity. I want to say also to the fathers in this group, happy Father's Day, and thank you for sharing your Father's Day with us on this very important issue. And for a few moments of your time, I won't be before you long. I mean, I can talk forever, and I try to be mindful of people's time, but I want to just start with, I've heard so much. I've been following the discussion, and I think we all know that the descendants of chattel slavery are entitled to restitution. And I think we're all in agreement with what that should be in terms of, firstly, a monetary payment. But what I'm troubled by and what bothers me is, in spite of this country's history of paying reparations, in spite of this country's willingness to go out of its way to atone for the harm that has been visited upon by other aggrieved groups, they have never, and I fear will never, be willing to come to terms with the reality that they owe the descendants of chattel slavery reparations. And I think that discussion has to be forced. In a sense, when I say force, and I just want to be careful of my words, I'm not talking about violence, but I'm talking about litigation. And what I encourage people to do, one of the things that, historically, what we found is the descendants of chattel slavery, if but for the interventions of racism and white supremacy, would have cultural property, would have physical property, would have wealth. But these things were plundered from them. And other people have taken that property and gone on to enrich themselves unjustly. And so, fortunately, in this country, the law allows redress. And when we look at the history of other aggrieved groups bringing cases before the courts, we see justice. And the law actually bends and contorts and shapes itself to prevent us from seeing justice. But what we have to do is hold a mirror up to this country and hold the Constitution up to this country and say, we demand equal justice. And so when we take these plundered incidents in history and bring them into courts, we have to also, as a body of people, as a group of people, follow these cases and support these cases, because what they will do in the dark of night is dismiss these cases. And so, what in my mind, and I know, I would love to see our Congress, particularly those former Confederate states, to look at the history of what they've done to the descendants of chattel slavery and say, we owe them, and this is how we're going to repay them. I pray I'm wrong, but I don't believe that this country is ready to face its ugly past. And so what we have to do is take cases to court and say, we are the victims of a plunder. We are the victims of the badges of slavery. This is illegal. This is unconstitutional by the letter of law, and we're seeking redress. And so my case will be one of a very few test cases. And I'm not going to take for granted that many are familiar with my case, but I started on a genealogical project at the behest of my mother. She wanted me, before she died, she put that responsibility on me to do a family tree, to do the genealogical work and trace our family ancestry. And so, of course, and this was in 2010, when we didn't have access to information and access to each other like we have today. In doing that, it was certainly a major task and something I wasn't quite familiar with, how to get to archives and how to do the archival research. And but I had promised my mother, so after her passing, I decided to do the genealogical research and put our family tree together. And when my mother would talk, my mother was a retired teacher from a small community called Mount Meigs, Montgomery, Alabama. And she migrated north, and she ultimately settled in Norwich, Connecticut. But she never missed an opportunity to tell us about our ancestry, about who our elders were. And my mother had the benefit of an oral history that began with the Black African that the family referred to as Papa Renty. And she would tell us these stories about Papa Renty, who he was, what he was, the kind of community person that everyone loved and respected. And she would say to us, always remember these things, never forget, never forget. And she would know my mother's oral history and my family's oral history was so accurate that we were able to retain the names of our formerly enslaved people as they passed through different slave trades. And so my mom knew those things. And she would say, always remember, we're Taylors, not Thompsons, because her great grandfather had been sold and became Thompson, but originally his name was Taylor. And so after her passing, I started the work of putting this genealogical project together. And with the help of a number of amazing people, I was able to definitively link myself to a man in the image who is known as Papa Renty. And I don't know if I'm going to be able to, but at some point I'd love to be able to put that image of him up on the screen and perhaps show you a video. But at any rate, I start doing this work. Not only do I find the image of Papa Renty, but I find this dark, ugly history associated with scientific racism that Harvard University perpetrated in the mid 1800s, 1850s. So Harvard University decided at a time when this country is almost as divided as it is now between slavery and emancipation as we are about divided along racial lines now. But Harvard, at this time, a pivotal time in our country's history, promoted this race science, saying that Blacks are a separate and lesser species, that they are not of the same blood as white people, and that they don't deserve the equal protections and treatments under the law. And again, this is at a time when, we're having this whole debate about slavery and whether to continue it or promote it or abolish it. Here you have the largest and the premier academic institution in the world who is promoting this scientific racism that Blacks are inferior. And not only are they promoting it to promote slavery, but there was also a financial motivation. Harvard at this time was in cahoots with South Carolina, and our case bears this out. But what you will see, what we've exposed is that, and this is something, certainly I wasn't taught growing up in history, but the North was more complicit or equally as complicit in slavery as the South, particularly Boston, where we had the Industrial Revolution. In my complaint, my attorney talks about, he refers to cotton, which was the thread that tied the Union together. Cotton was the really the engine of the economy. It was that drove the economy, and the South was profiting from cotton, and the North even more so, and particularly Boston. And these the leaders of the university at that time were all heavily invested in cotton. And so they had a financial motive to promote slavery. So what do? They create this scientific justification. And again, Harvard at the time, the premier academic institution in the world, when they spoke, people listened. This scientist who created this race science, Louis Agassiz, he actually met with Abraham Lincoln. And then after this meeting, you see in the Frederick Douglass debate, him espousing this white scientific racism principle. And so Harvard had influence at that time. But what they wanted to do is provide ocular proof that Black people were starkly different from white. And so they traveled south and they visited the Benjamin Franklin Taylor plantation where my enslaved ancestors were held. And they took pictures, nude pictures. They had the men stripped naked. They poked, they prodded, they measured their body parts, and they measured the women's the length, the size of their breasts. They measured the men. They took pictures, frontal nudity, rear nudity, all for the purposes of saying this is not human. And so, and then they use this. Now, it's not clear how many times they use these images, but the goal was to create a propaganda that said that Blacks don't deserve equal protection because they're not human. They're not of the same blood as us. And so that science and those images, particularly of my great-great-grandfather Renty, I refer to them as the original mugshot, the original attempt to devalue and demoralize a Black life, to criminalize, to target, to marginalize Black life. The daguerreotypes are some of the earliest opportunities for photos. And what do? Immediately, as soon as we see the opportunity for photos, we see them devaluing and criminalizing and marginalizing Black men and Black life. And that concept didn't go away. It evolved into what we have today with the racial profiling and this the planting of subliminal messages, marginalizing, criminalizing, and devaluing Black life. And so Harvard, I mean, now keep in mind, these scientists, these philosophers, they knew what they were doing. And this psychological warfare, which was waged against Black people, is something that started here in the United States, but spread it as a virus all over the world. Louis Agassiz is known as the father of apartheid, the father of medical apartheid, the father of scientific racism, the father of the eugenics movement. This racism that started at Harvard spread all throughout the world. And again, the impact that it had on devaluing and marginalizing Black men and Black life. And so when I talk about injury, and not taking away from the physical assaults that our enslaved ancestors endured, but when they criminalize a race, and when they demoralize a race, and when they devalue a race, and that concept spreads worldwide, we can't even begin to measure or imagine the extent of the injury that has caused. And that's all, we lay that all on Harvard's doorstep. But getting back to my research and doing the research, I discovered my Papa Renty that my mom had told me so much about. And I discovered that he's at Peabody's Museum. Originally, they were in the Museum of Comparative Zoology because this is what Agassiz did. He compared animals. And he saw Black people as animals, and that's why they were in the School of Zoology. And I'm like, okay, this is a stark difference from the paparenty that my mom talked about, and the oral history, the rich oral history of who this man was. My mom told stories about this man. He was literate. Paparenti got a hold of a book that's called Noah Webster's Blueback Speller, and he taught himself to read. Not only taught himself to read, but he taught others to read. And then he taught from the Bible, and he would hold Bible lessons. And there's just so many stories about him. And keep in mind, when he was doing these things, it was illegal to do. So he did this at his own peril. And so the paparenti, again, that my mom talked about was a stark difference from this race science, Black inferiority that Harvard is promoting. And so I reach out to Harvard, and I'm like, and also they're writing books about these daguerreotypes. They're hosting seminars and international seminars about the daguerreotypes. And they lead with, we know nothing about these people in the images. Their stories are, at the time, they were promoting and celebrating Louis Agassiz. And I'm like, hold on, this man is a sick scientific racist. How are you promoting him and marginalizing my ancestors? And so I'm like, tell the truth about who Louis Agassiz was, and tell the truth about who my Papa Renty was. This man was literate. He was an educator. He had a rich oral history. He was a community. Tell his story, not your narrative. And so every time I would approach Harvard with that, they would dismiss me. And they were pleasant about it. Thank you for your interest. We'll keep you informed or whatever, but never taking my claim seriously. I reached out to them. I said, here's the genealogical workup that I have. Take a look at it so you can confirm with me that I am Renty's granddaughter. And here is his rich oral history. Start talking about who he was. And the amazing thing about our oral history, and I say it's amazing, I'm still shocked. But this is a history that starts in at least the early to mid 1800s that I'm still telling today in 2022. But when I'm doing the genealogical research, and when I'm later helped with other people to do the genealogical research, the history that my mom talked about matches up perfectly with all of the documents, the records, the census data, everything. My mom never saw those documents, but the story she told, it was almost as if she were reading from those documents. That's how accurate our oral history was. And when I speak on that, I like to tell people that my mom left me a blueprint. She left me a map from us to Papa Renty. And the way I trace back, there is a straight line. And it's amazing because many people will dissuade you or discount oral histories, but no. We had our own way of history telling and keeping records, and that was orally done. And usually in every family there is a keeper of that story. And let me tell you, that is about as accurate or more accurate than our history and our historical documents, our historical records, because our oral history is all we had, and our only way of keeping up with it And when our ancestors told us, they told us with a purpose, and that purpose was to, so that the next generation will know who we were. And so they don't let anyone dissuade you or discourage you about oral history. It's about as accurate a history or an account as you're going to have for our ancestors. So, but just getting back to where I was with Harvard, I'm talking to them. I reach out to Henry Gates. I'm emailing him. I'm calling him. I'm speaking with his assistant. Can somebody look at my documents? And can you look at what we have for a rich cultural history for Renty? And can you tell that story as opposed to this fake narrative that you've created? No responses. And so after years of back and forth with Harvard, I suddenly became aware that they're not working with me in good faith. They're not speaking. There's no interest in knowing the true history and legacy of these people. They wanted to continue along with their own, I call it a cultural appropriation of these enslaved people's story. And that's what they wanted to promote, irregardless of what the facts were. And the last straw for me was a conference that I attended at Harvard where I walked in and they had this huge picture of my Papa Renty. It filled the entire room. He was basically covering the entire back wall. And when they got up to speak about him, they referred to him as invisible. They said, again, they know nothing about who he was. Too bad he didn't leave a rich oral history. Now, this time, they all knew the truth. They all knew who he was. They all knew who I was, but they continued with that. So when I walked out of that conference, I knew, firstly, that this is something that would never set well with my mother because of who this man was to her, that I had to do something to correct the narrative. And sadly, I started talking with people and different attorneys, and no one was interested. Like, are you kidding? Who's going to take a 200-year-old slavery reparations case? So for years now, I went to conferences. I had the pleasure of meeting Congressman John Conyers. I shared this story with him, and he invited me to come to his annual reparations conference. I met with Cobra and all of those people, Sir Hilary Beckles. I have gone everywhere and talked to everyone associated with reparations that I can think of. And at the time, no matter where they were, I would go to them, I would reach out to them, and I would share this story looking for help. And so I spoke to everyone. I spoke with attorneys. This is a reparations case. And so I'm a retired chief probation officer, and I happened to go to a criminal justice workshop. And I think this was in 2017, or it may have been 2016. And Attorney Ben Crump was on the dais. He was speaking about the disparities in the criminal justice system. And I went up to him and I spoke with him just very briefly. I was in the process of taking a selfie. And as fast as I could, I was trying to tell him about my plight with Harvard and that I really need an attorney because I believe that this is a reparations case. I believe that it's unique in that, I can prove that I am the linear descendant of an enslaved person who has property rights in something valuable. And he was interested, and we exchanged business cards and other information, and he said that he'd get back to me. But at the moment, I just thought he was just being pleasant and just nicely moving me along. But lo and behold, like a week or so later, he calls and he says, I'm really interested in this case. And I explained more about, the problems with Harvard and how they have, not only did Harvard exercise absolute dominion and control over these daguerreotypes, but if you used a copy of it without their permission, they would sue you. And there is an amazing story about a Black artist who went and saw, her name is Carrie Mae Weems, but she went and saw the daguerreotypes and was so shocked and offended and upset. She made a copy of it to come back to New York and do an exhibit. Harvard threw her in court, threatened to sue her. But what was revealed is that Harvard doesn't have good title to these daguerreotypes. Um, and this is where our lawsuit comes in. Attorney Crump, after some, he had to go back and talk with his partners who were reluctant, but ultimately agreed to take the case. He needed to find a Connecticut attorney to partner with because he's not licensed. But everything falls into place, and we have the attorneys, and we start doing a deeper dive with the research. What we find is when Harvard commissioned these daguerreotypes, um, they did it illegally because years ago in 1784, 83, 84, the state of Massachusetts had abolished slavery, not only abolishing slavery, but said that enslaved people or formerly enslaved people or um, Black people had the right to seek legal redress. They had the right to own property, and they were given the same rights as anyone else. So Harvard violated their rights when they did this. And the other interesting legal aspect of this is Harvard was saying that first they said Renty and Delia don't have a property interest in the daguerreotypes because they couldn't own property, or essentially saying because they were slaves. And so that went over like a ton of bricks. They quickly changed that to say Renty and Delia don't have a property interest in the daguerreotypes because that the subject of a photo, if you sit for a photo, that the absolute control and interest belongs to the photographer. Even if the photographer kidnaps you, even if the photographer takes you to this obscure location and makes you take off your clothes, even if they make you to do this against your will, to the point like in Delia's case where she cried, that they still own those photos, which makes no sense. So we filed, and Harvard developed that argument, and we countered with, you know, this was a crime in the state of Massachusetts at the time, and that wrongdoers are never rewarded with the fruits of their crime. It just doesn't happen in law that you give someone who committed a crime and did something in furtherance of that crime the fruits or the proceeds of that crime and let them use that to go on and be unjustly enriched. It just doesn't happen. So we were very comfortable with our case. And so ultimately, we went before the Massachusetts lower court, and the court dismissed the case. Harvard filed a motion to dismiss, and the court granted it, and basically said that a criminal can keep their proceeds of their crime, which didn't make any sense. And to my earlier point, that's why I'm saying when we do bring these cases, we have to bring all we can to bear to support these cases, to follow these cases, to speak out on these cases, because if they know people are watching, they're inclined to do the right thing. Kind of like racial profiling in the police wearing body camera. When they know that cameras on them and people are watching, their conduct changes and they do what they're supposed to do. And that's why when we bring these cases, we have to support them wholeheartedly with all we can, because I don't want to say it helps it helps to ensure justice, because again, when they no one's watching, they'll dismiss this in the dark of night, and it goes away, and it goes away from the headlines, and then it's just a dead case. And so what we did was we appealed. We appealed the court's decision, and again, we had amicus briefs from people from all over the world. A German attorney wrote a brief talking about, and what I loved about her brief is that she said the world never criminalized slavery like they did to the victims of the Holocaust. They made it a crime, and there was no criminalization or protection for the descendants of slaves or chattel slavery, or protections in terms of the law, and that the world never condemned it. And we had briefs from Harvard students, one student in particular who's an archivist, and I think he's studying law now. He did the research and found that Harvard doesn't have good title, that there is this document that you should have if something is gifted to you, no matter when it was, in the 1850s or today, that shows that the person who gave it to you had a right to give it to you. And he talked about the fact that, what the protocol requires is if you have a document that an artifact that isn't properly documented, you have to return it. You have to repatriate it. And so we filed in Massachusetts Superior Court. We were heard by the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court on November 1st of 2021, and they were supposed to decide the case in 130 days. And so we were expecting a decision around February or March, and we haven't had a decision yet. But there is an oral argument that I would encourage everyone to look at. It's basically the Supreme Court justices said to Harvard, if you kidnap someone and force them to take nude pictures, you don't get to keep those pictures. One justice talked about the fact of cultural property, and that she said that there are laws that require repatriation of Native American cultural relics. There are laws that require the repatriation of Japanese and Native. Why aren't there laws to require the repatriation of cultural relics of African Americans? And the Harvard attorney says, that's a good point, but there isn't. And the one thing that he said in his argument that troubled me, he talked about the history of these arguments about cultural property, and that there is a reason why these specific arguments don't belong in court. And so I took that to mean that there is a reason why the court does not want to look at repairing the harm, restoring, or repatriating the cultural property of chattel slavery. And he said that there's just no place for it in the court, which in my mind was, I felt like a slap in the face at that point, because he's saying we can address and seek redress for these other aggrieved groups, but don't bring these cases. These cases don't belong in court. And so if we follow the letter of the law, we deserve the same protections as the other groups who have petitioned for their cultural property back. And so, one of the things that the Harvard attorney kept saying over and over again is Tammy doesn't have a property interest. Tammy doesn't have a property interest. And he said that knowing that my argument is if Renty and Delia as crime victims have a property interest in their own body, then I have a right to inherit that property interest. It is simple. It is law, but it gets all twisted and torted when you're talking about slavery and redress for the descendants of chattel slavery. They're like, oh, the law is what it is. But then when you try to apply it to matters involving reciprocity for slavery, they get all confused and, oh, we can't do this. And for me personally, I believe this is what is going to open the door when we start to hold them to the letter of the law and saying we want our equal protections. And I can tell you what they have gone out, our country, our federal government has gone out of its way to seek redress for other aggrieved groups. I have shared previously in other platforms, the government links that speak about the billions of dollars that the United States government has paid to address the harm caused by the Holocaust. I heard some discussion earlier about the redress for the victims, the Japanese American victims. It's not rocket science. We have done this before, but there is a flat out refusal to move forward when it involves the descendants of chattel slavery. And I don't know, in my heart of hearts, I don't know that will change, because we are so deeply rooted in the racism and the history of racism in this country. And so what I believe our best efforts should be directed towards holding the country to the letter of the law and seeking redress. My attorneys are hearing from victims like Henrietta Lacks, her family. I have been tagged on social media and reached out to on social media from Jack Daniels, Aunt Jemima's family. We have a rich cultural history. Much of it was plundered from us. And with the access to information at our fingertips now, we can trace that down and go back and say, our property was plundered from us and we want it back, just as other people have, and have gotten that back without any hesitation. But when we talk about the cultural relics and the cultural property of chattel slavery, it's like we suspend all the rules and throw everything out the window, and that can't be. And so, this is kind of an overview of my story, an abbreviated version. But I certainly believe that as the definition of reparations is laid out for us, there's no more of an aggrieved group than the descendants of chattel slavery, to the extent, um, and it should not even be debatable. And I applaud the states who are independently seeking to do something, but the goal, the end game, is to make the federal government do what it's supposed to do, and that is to pay the reparations. And if we have to start by suing people, then that's where we should start. I,
Thank you for that. That was amazing. So let's ask some questions now. So what was your first start in terms of looking and determining what your lineage is and connecting it to Renty?
what was the first start? Well, like I said, I was blessed by the efforts of so many people. The first, when I first learned of the image, it was from a gentleman, a senior gentleman who lives in my home community. He was an ice cream shop owner, and I was out walking one afternoon for my lunch break, and I stopped in a shop after my walk to pick up a salad. And I mentioned to him, I said, did I share with you my mom had passed away? And I started talking to him about the promise that I had made to document our genealogy. And I said, I don't know how to do the research. And keeping in mind at this time, a lot of that required legwork. The internet was just coming into existence then, and access to it. I mean, I had the internet, but I didn't know what to do with it. And when this, like, Rich may have been in his mid to late 70s, early 80s, he said, I love to search on the internet. Let me take a look and see what I can find. So I wrote down the names that I had, and I remember talking about Renty being an African born person. And so when he found the daguerreotypes online, and also the story about Agassiz needing, one of the things in Louis Agassiz's science, and the reason why he chose my enslaved ancestors, were they were a pure type. These people were born in Africa and hadn't been tainted by any for the women's sexual assaults or anything that might have made them biracial or something of that sort. So he wanted pure Africans. He wanted, because he felt that if he got a mixed blood person who was highly functional, it would be because of the white blood they shared, or their biracial, the advances in that person were associated with the white blood. So he wanted someone who was pure type, purely African. He chose my enslaved ancestors. And he did this for, again, the purpose of saying that they were inferior. And so when Rich was doing the research, he found the story about this scientific racism in the Black race, and he sent me all of that. And so, that day is something that's seared in my memory. I remember when I got home from work, I sat down and I said, let me take a look at what Rich has put together. Um, he he sent first that scientific racism and the story about that. And I'm like, oh my gosh, this is some really sick stuff. And then I saw the image of my Papa Renty. That was the next attachment that I opened. And I knew immediately that that was him. And I just, it's funny because I called my daughters to come and see the image, and we all recognize something in us that we saw in him. And just we had heard so many stories about him. Like my daughter talked about the fact that she had created this image in her mind of who this man was, and then to see him in person, we were excited to see him. And then all of a sudden that high dropped to a very low, because we knew this picture was taken, that our ancestors were used as scientific subjects to prove white supremacy. So we go from excited and jubilant to angry. um, and that's what really set me on the course to reach out to Harvard and say, you got this wrong, you got to fix this. And they never embraced that at all.
Thank you for sharing that. I think your story is super amazing, super precious, especially, like I said, your journey to even discovering it. When you figured out your lineage, how did you take your discovery and take that kind of wisdom and decide to then take on Harvard? What was that process like? What was the process like for bringing on an attorney and kind of just going through this journey of battling that we're still in the midst of, because hopefully we're on the verge of hearing your verdict.
Yeah, I hope so. Well, I have said often that I believe that God put people in my path, information at my fingertips, and really set me on a journey, on a course, that led me directly to amazing pieces of information. And doing the genealogical research wasn't easy. Certainly, I had the help of great people. Another and I some people would refer to them as coincidences or incidents that are hard to explain. I say, there was just the divine intervention. I did as much as I could with the research. Then I said, because every time Harvard would speak publicly about this case, they would say, there's no way that she can definitively link herself to the man in the image. And that my Papa Renty that I talk about is a different Papa Renty from the man that is in the daguerreotype. And so I did a lot of the work, and everything seemed to line up perfectly to me. So ultimately, I was talking with my daughter, and I said, we need a genealogist. And so my daughter was talking about the case at work with her friend, who said, I have one of the best genealogists in the world. He's a good friend of mine and he owes me a favor. I can reach out to him. And so she did. And within moments, he reached out to us. And it turns out he's the same man who did President Barack Obama's genealogy. And he was a well-known and well-respected genealogist. And he helped us get a number of supportive documents and information, the wills, probate records, slave indexes, all of these things. He helped us to secure that information, and just strengthening our argument that this man is our ancestor. And so we're sharing with the media. The media is writing more stories, and Harvard is saying she's never going to get the daguerreotypes back, and there's no way she can prove it. And we continue to build and build and build. And then what I start doing is I actually went to a seminar on archaeology and slavery. And the gentleman who was speaking, he kept saying, the truth is in the ground. And he talked about going to spaces where slaves or enslaved people lived, and doing the archaeology and the work and digging up and uncovering how they lived. And so it dawned on me that I need to start looking in slave burial grounds for where my ancestors lived and died. And lo and behold, one of the things that I did was I had a number of birth records and death records at this time. And I had joined a lot of social media groups. One of them was Lower Country, South Carolina. And I'm connecting with people. And I meet another woman who also descended from the same slaveholders. plantation, and she was still living in Columbia, South Carolina. And so, in talking with Rose, and this time I'm looking for Delia and where Delia might have been buried. And so Rose, her name is Rose Shiver. She said to me, I saw a Delia Thompson that might be a good match with your Delia, and that she was associated with a person, George Thompson. And I said, well, that's a good match because I have George's death record. So she said, send it to me. And I did. And then she replied back. She says, oh my God. And I'm like, oh my God, what? And so ultimately I picked up the phone and I'm like, Rose, oh my God, what? And she said, George Thompson, my great, great, great uncle, lived and died in Arthurtown and is buried in the Child Cemetery in South Carolina. And I'm saying yes, because that's on the death record. She said, that is the slaveholder's property. And so I'm like, how do you know that? And she said, my family brought that property from the slaveholder and established Arthurtown. And I'm like, oh my God, Rose, how can we prove this? And she said, I have the deed. And she texted me a copy. And so that gave me the chills, because when you think of all the people that you can meet on social media, the billions of people that you can meet, I happen to connect with the one person who could look at that death record and know that Arthurtown was property that was bought by their family. Rose is the family historian and the keeper of her family story, but no one else would have been able to look at that document and make that connection. So now I put my family on the slaveholders' land, that they lived there and died there. Harvard still dismissed it. And so I knew that they were, and at that moment, because there's no more for me to research at this point when I can put my family on the slaveholders' land. I'm questioning now, Harvard, what is your motivation? Why are you acting like this? Why are you so dismissive of something that's so historically significant? And what it turns out, and what I believe, because Harvard will never tell me why, but the one thing that I think stands out is, and again, this comes from the Harvard law students. He wrote a brief for us, and one of the things that he developed in that brief was the notion that Harvard archives bear strange fruits. But in other words, Harvard archives are a cesspool of inhumanity. Everything that they're holding there, everything that they're keeping there, is the plundered property, or most of the things that they're keeping there are plundered property that they need to give back. So when you think about Harvard's wealth and its access to these invaluable relics, and then suddenly having to give them all back, how that might impact them, we think maybe that's why they're acting this way. But again, it goes back to the notion, when you look at your museums and what they curate and the stories they tell, um, firstly, I don't believe I have seen where they curate and keep the remains of anything other than Black or Native American or other aggrieved groups. And so there's almost this entitlement that we won't do these injustices to other groups, but we can do it to the descendants of chattel slavery. And so Harvard right now is being called out for holding the human remains and the Native American remains that I think of over 1,700 or 1,000. I'm not sure what the number is, but it's even if it's one, it's still an injustice and a wrong. But Harvard has a motivation for fighting me to this degree, because I believe if this case moves forward and I prevail, the precedent it would set could cause many museums to go out of business because of the plundered property that they hold, and that they appropriate those stories and tell the stories from their perspective, as opposed to the violence associated at how they accumulated those relics. So it's been a journey. Like I said, I have had so many good people to step up. Rose is another one. I actually was able to find the great great grandson of Benjamin Franklin Taylor, Dr. Edmund Taylor. He lived in Columbia, South Carolina when I found him. He has since passed away, but before then, he invited me to come and spend the weekend in Columbia, South Carolina. That was very interesting. It was something, I did because I needed to speak with him and I needed to know what became of the slaveholders' children because I know my family was dispersed amongst those children. So I needed his insight. I tried to get my daughters to come with me. They were like, "You're crazy, mom. We're not going." But I don't have any regrets about going because, like I said, I got a wealth of information from Dr. Taylor. The one thing he did was that afternoon, we had dinner at his house, and he was 98 years old at the time. And he set an amazing table for us. And then he said that we were eating from the slaveholder Benjamin Franklin Taylor's dishes, and that the table we were sitting at was hand carved by the family carpenter. And of course, at that moment, I almost fell out of the chair because I knew from reading the will, I had virtually memorized the will, but I knew that at that time, my enslaved ancestor was the family carpenter. And so I'm like, oh my God, I am sitting at a table that and chairs, and the woodwork and the detail was amazing. And I did take pictures of that. But I was just like trapped in that moment because I'm thinking I'm sitting at a table and chair that was handcuffed by my enslaved ancestors, and I was just in awe of not only the the detail of the carpentry, but just the stability of the table and the things that were at least 150, 60, or 70 years old. A lot of great things. He talked about the fact that the family knew that some of the slaves could read, um, and that they were ministers of the Bible. He was telling me stories that I had heard from the slaveholders' perspective, the same stories that I had heard from my mom from Renty's perspective. They were the same exact stories. He talked about the fact that the Taylor family operated an underground railroad to Ohio. I have my mom recorded talking about one of her great great cousins went to Ohio on the Underground Railroad. So, it was just, like it was an amazing experience. And the one thing that I felt he was trying to convince me that his family, that they were good slaveholders. And he talked about, he specifically said the Taylors treated their slaves with dignity and respect. And respectful as I said to him, Dr. Taylor, I don't think that dignity and slavery belong in the same sentence. But I was trying to gather information, and he was trying to convince me that they were good people. And the other thing that I took from that experience is, again, I called it the Northern aggression, where he talked about not only Louis Agassiz and other people from Boston coming to the Taylor plantation, but they did so. And he also talked about Daniel Webster, who was then the man who would have been president, but he was the senator from Massachusetts at the time. And you see the collaboration with Webster and Sumner at the time. But he talked about the fact that after these people who traveled traveled from the north to the plantation, went back home, they spoke publicly and said, "We'll never speak against slavery again." And I remember saying to him, "Do you think that there was some political motivation for all these people who," and again, keep in mind when you're traveling from Boston to South Carolina in 1850, it's not you catch on a plane and you're there within a couple of hours. This was a 2-week journey, all to this same plantation, all to see these same slaves, and then go back north preaching and promoting slavery because it was humane. And the Taylors felt that they were good slaves because the North came down and said, "You're doing a good job with your slaves." But what it was that propaganda to promote slavery, and they were trying to convince the abolitionists at the time that slavery could be tolerable. And when I talk about, again, what Harvard has to own, they have to own those things because it caused such an injury that we really can't explain or define. But those are all the things that the research ultimately helped to build my case. And finally, the woman who certified my genealogy, who said I meet and far exceed any legal title to kinship, was the woman who did Michelle Obama's genealogy. Her name is Toni Courier. And she, and Harvard can't attack her credibility because she is also the person who does the research for Henry Gates's "Who Do You Think You Are" show. So it's, like I said, I have had great people to step up and step in and assist me, and people with impeccable credentials and credibility. And I look back and marvel at how me, like I said, I'm just, a simple person. I don't have how I have access to these people and how these things all fell into place. I believe that there was just a divine intervention for the story. It's a purpose driven story, and I hope the purpose is to force the conversation about reparations and to bring a legal claim that everyone will have to look at and acknowledge is a just and right thing to do.
Yes, definitely. It has to be a claim we all have to be able to claim.
Mhm.
You are like kind of someone who's leading the pathway in terms of this. So I think it's amazing. I was looking at the definition of reparation, and I'm gonna just read a part of it really quickly because I do think it's important. Um, One of the last parts of the definition talks about having uh, not only compensation and satisfaction, but here's the full list. I want to read it to you. So um, give me 1 second. Restitution, compensation, rehabilitation, satisfaction, and guarantees of non-repetition. So not only with your case in terms of what you think needs to happen and God willing will happen, but what do you think in terms of those definitions should not only happen in your case, but should happen with others
Mhm.
as they discover their lineage and as they fight for what they're owed, like now?
Mhm. And so, it's interesting that you raise that because, again, in the case, um, the court talks about, that there's no restitution here, that there is no harm because the subjects don't have access, the property interest in the photos. And so, when I look at that argument, I'm like, who are you to say that I and my family have not been harmed? And how, is it that that goes unchallenged and that you decide a case based on that foolishness? And so when you read the definition of reparations and certainly the assurance that this will never happen again, we are kind of relying on humanity to say, to see that, to embrace that, and to embrace those principles. But I guess I just don't see us ready for that, in a sense that there is so much inhumanity that we still see every day. We turn on social media and it seems to almost be getting worse. And so, um, in my mind, the question is, do we continue to look to lawmakers who are a part of this inhumanity, many of them, and almost promoting hate and divisiveness, to have this epiphany that we need to do the right things for the the descendants of chattel slavery? And so I'm just not there that I see them ready to do that. But the court has a different position. It has an obligation to uphold the law. And there, like I said, in our victimization, we're entitled to something. We're entitled to redress and what that looks like. And it's that is where I believe we have to begin the fight. And when these cases start making headway in headlines, then I think the tide will change. We're not going to change hearts and minds of the people, the haters, the dividers, and those who oppose reparations. But when we start to get legal judgments that uphold the law, then I think that we will start to make the headway we need to move forward with the assurances that are promised in that definition of reparations.
Awesome, thank you. So I just want to add a little bit to that because um, I think one thing that's important in your case, particularly, not only do I believe personally, should you get the daguerreotypes returned to you as a descendant of Renty? But I also believe that Harvard should compensate you from the revenue and profits that they've made over this time period.
Mm,
And if they decide, or if you decide to let them host those daguerreotypes and still make money, that you should be uh, allocated a revenue percentage from that so you can do what you may as a descendant.
yeah.
Now, one of the definition of reparation from the UN, like I mentioned, has compensation in it. Now, here's the definition. It says compensation should be provided for any economically accessible damage as appropriate and proportional to the gravity of the violation and the circumstances of each case, meaning your case as well, resulting from gross violations of international human rights law and serious violations of international humanitarian law, such as A. Physical or mental harm, B. Lost opportunities, including employment, education, social benefits, C. Material damages, um, loss of earnings, including loss of potential earnings, D. Moral damage, E. Costs required for legal or expert assistance. So all the work you've had to go to even look at your whole lineage, even
Hmm.
medicine and medical services and psychological and social services. So just on that, in terms of compensation, you are owed. That comes from direct from the UN
Mm,
and the only two crimes that the UN recognizes are genocide and uh, war crimes.
mm,
And this is part of a genocide and
mhm.
part of a definition for uh, not only solving it, but remedying it in terms of what the UN agreed upon so far.
Mhm.
Compensation. So you're duly, um, you know, you deserve this. You know what
Yeah.
I mean? So
And
what are your thoughts on that?
I I like that definition. And when you were reading it, I was thinking about the descendants of the Tulsa tragedy. Imagine if they take that language and bring it to court. Anyone who can associate themselves as a descendant of those victims are entitled to reparations. I was reading about, and I think it's in Georgia, Lake Lanier. And the story about that case was that there was another incident where I believe a white woman claimed she was assaulted or raped or something. And what the town did was they opened a levee that flooded a black community and it's underwater. And, and this was a racially motivated incident. But, this is where we talk about, we would, but for racism and hatred, have the generational wealth, but it was plundered from us. It was stolen from us. But if we can attach ourselves to these incidents and bring cases and saying we deserve redress here, um, the courts have to act. The courts have to act. We're not going to get the I just feel we're not in a place where that is going to move the needle forward. The issue of reparations has been bantered about for years, and it's always been dead on arrival. But we have the right to seek legal redress. We're promised that in the Constitution, and we have to start doing that. And that definition, I mean, it's not rocket science. That's clear language. And these incidents fall into those categories very neatly. We just need to start finding attorneys to bring these cases in court. And trust me, our civil justice system won't know what hit it, because they'll have to either deny the constitutional rights of these plaintiffs or uphold the Constitution. And then we will start to see some transference of wealth.
I definitely agree. Let me let me bring up one more point. We have about 7 minutes left, but this is huge when it comes to, we talked about, addressing the claim. Now the UN definition talks about satisfaction, which means
Mhm.
you have to be satisfied
Mhm.
with what happens. Now
Mhm.
here's what it says, and I won't read all of it, maybe because of the time. If we have a little bit more time, I'll go into it. But just the part that I think is important to what you're going through and what you mentioned about Tulsa.
Mhm.
B, it says verification of the facts. Verifications of the fact and full and public disclosure of the truth. To the extent that such disclosure does not cause further harm, which would be to you, or harm or threaten the safety and interests of the victim, which would be to you, right? The victim's relatives, witnesses, or persons who have intervened to assist the victim or prevent the occurrence of further violations.
Mhm.
Now, here's the second part, especially when you mention Tulsa. It says the search for the whereabouts of the disappeared, the for the identities of children abducted, of the and for the bodies of those killed, and the assistance in the recovery, identification, and reburial
Mm.
of the bodies in accordance with the expressed or presumed wish of the victims, the cultural practices, or of the families and communities, which means anything that Harvard does would have to satisfy your wishes and your satisfaction in terms of what you would feel
Mhm.
honors your ancestor Renty.
Yeah. And that is an amazing document. And I just think that that should be the framework moving forward by our government to embrace these principles and live out, act out what these principles suggest. That would be true justice. I have my reservations because, like I say, every day I turn on my social media or my television, I see divisiveness and hate and a resistance to tell the truth about what really happened. I am just learning some of the horrors of slavery and what happened to the descendants of slavery. And and listening to the conversations earlier, we were promised 40 acres. We were forced back to the slaveholder because the when the emancipation happened, the government pulled out and left us vulnerable to terrorists. And so, but in that same vein and along that same time, they're giving away land to immigrants from other countries. Just a blatant disregard for Black life. And that's historically how this country has treated Black people. And people would argue today that we are still living in that same mindset with this blatant devaluing of Black life. And so how do we move forward? And are we going to try to soften the hearts and change the minds of some of the politicians from these Confederate states? um, I just see that, I don't see that happening anytime soon. But I'm not dissuading or discouraging that, but I'm saying along those same lines, we need to get attorneys, the NAACP, the ACLU, and other attorneys to start bringing these actions against people who plundered the property of African Americans, descendants of chattel slavery. And I think that maybe this two pronged approach might be the way to move this needle a little faster forward, a little faster. And I just, but, and there's another sad reality. I don't see attorneys stepping up to take these cases. And I don't understand why. These are landmark cases. The one that finally does shatter the glass ceiling and make it through will be the first time in history. I'm praying, that my case is successful, but we have not had a major reparations breakthrough in court. And young Black attorneys should be, this should be, what they strive for, what they, what they live to practice for, a case such as this. Um, so, I'm just optimistic that if we work from the grassroots and from the courtrooms, simultaneously, we'll be able to move this needle forward a little faster.
Definitely. I agree 100%. And I'm wishing you the best in your case. I'm thinking you're going to win hands down.
Yes.
If it doesn't, we're going to appeal, and do
Yes.
whatever we got to do to make sure you win at the end of the day.
We have to support each other.
We have to. We have to. We have to raise our voices, and let it be known what
Yes.
you're going through. We got to point out the contradiction that Harvard did. We got to heighten the contradictions, as the Black Panther Party said, and talk about how Harvard can talk about a report and publish their own report on their own crimes without mentioning. They mentioned Renty, but did not mention your own case that they're currently going through. They did not mention the debt that they owe you with the daguerreotypes that they referenced in their report.
They throw out $100 million, and for that's a lot of money. I mean, I'm not thumbing my nose at, but for Harvard, that is chump change. That is pennies for Harvard, because their endowment is like, I don't know, it's greater than 50 some odd $billion, and so $100 million, the way my attorneys frame it, they can pick up that amount of money in a couple of weeks. That is no money for Harvard, but what it was a distraction. It was they were getting out ahead of this judgment because they know it's coming, and when the court is going to find they did wrong, they're going to say, but look, we just threw $100 million out. And mind you, they didn't earmark it for anything. They just pledged to do it. They've done that before and not spent a penny. So it was a carefully orchestrated distraction. The reason they're being sued, everything they pledged in that report is exactly why they're being sued. And if they embodied those principles, I wouldn't need to bring a lawsuit. I wouldn't even be here today talking, because it would have been resolved 12 years ago. But so that was a carefully orchestrated. They owed their PR person that put that together a ton of gratitude. It really gave them a lot of positive press for a couple of weeks.
So thank you for that, Tamara. So we're going to segue into Cherie and talk about exactly how you went through your own personal search. Cherie is an expert on genealogy and how people can find their own roots and their own genealogy search so they can find their own Renty and their story. Everyone is a Tamara Lanier in this story, and that's a Friedman, and everyone has a Renty in their story. I found mine. I trace back to 1834 at least, and I can tell you everyone has their own Renty. Everyone is a Tamara Lanier. So
I encourage everyone to do the research, because you never know, looking in your family tree, what you might find. If I hadn't have looked for Papa Renty, I never would have been on this journey. So everyone should do. I'm sure if you are out there being the public service person that you are, you do it because it's in your DNA, because there was a great person who came before you who was doing great things then. So look into your history and discover your family stories. And I'm sure you will find amazing facts just like I did.
Exactly. Thank you so much, Ms. Tamara Lanier, for spending this Juneteenth with us. Happy Juneteenth. Happy Father's Day to any children.
I celebrate it too.
Yeah, you know what I mean? We got to throw it out. It takes two, you know what I mean? Thank you for coming here. And it really means a lot to all the freedmen. And we are rooting for you to take down Harvard, to win your case, to get justice for your ancestor Renty, to free Renty, as you made the hashtag popular. I love your profile picture of Renty in there and trying to show Harvard why they have him kind of encaged and why they need
Mhm, mhm.
experience. So it's beautiful. So thank you for that so much.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah.